This is Main Street with Gary Allen. Now, here's Gary.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to Main Street. I'm Gary Allen. We've got a jam-packed show for you today. We have a wonderful guest on. But before we get to the guest, let me ask you a question. Would you die for a lie? If you knew somebody had been lying to you for 3 years, would you die for them in the end? It's a good question. That's a question that's been asked for ages, ever since the crucifixion and resurrection of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. If he is who he is, then Christianity continues to move forward. If he wasn't, then why did all the peoples since the crucifixion and the martyrdom of the disciples, why have they sacrificed their lives? So again, would you die for a lie? Only you can answer that, but hopefully we'll give you some ideas that will be answering the question at the end of the show. My guest today is Dr. Steve Osborne. He's an experimental psychologist who went on a personal journey to discover the truth on God, Jesus, and science. Do they all come together? Did God create all of what we see in front of us and the entire universe? Well, that's the journey he went on, and that's what we're going to talk about during this hour with his wonderful book, Beyond Chance, From the Big Bang to the Empty Tomb. So would you please welcome Dr. Steve Osborne to the program. As I said in the introduction, you came to this subject matter as a skeptic. So let's take that first. How long were you a skeptic / atheist before you said, I better take a journey. I better find out if what I believe and what I think is correct. And then we'll get into why you took this journey.
Okay. I was what I call a godless pagan, which is somewhere on the other side of skeptic, for 29 years. I always say pretty close to 30, but it was about 29 years.
Okay.
And I truly was a godless pagan. I mean, I really was. I was really good at sinning. So, at that point in my life, I was not hostile to God. I didn't necessarily say there couldn't be a God, but quite frankly, my feeling at the time was, if there was a God, so what? I had lived almost 30 years without him, gone through a pretty hellacious adolescence and young adulthood, a lot of hard times, a lot of trials, and I got there without God. And so by the time I'm 29 years old, I'm a third-year graduate student. My work is being published. I have a wife I love, a couple of kids that I'm nuts about. So life is good. Other than being desperately poor, I was really happy with my life.
Yeah. It's amazing. I've often said this to people who are friends of mine. By the way, do you mind if I call you Steve, or would you prefer Dr. Osborne?
Steve is good.
All right, Steve. I know people that are filthy rich. I mean, filthy rich. One of them is a very famous actor friend of mine who's won a number of Academy Awards, and he's one of the most unhappy people I know on earth. And I said to him, well, what are you doing? And he said, I'm searching for what it is, a meaning for me. And I didn't bother to bring up religion or anything. And then he called me up one day and he said, I started reading the Bible. It's changed my life. What was it that propelled you after 29 years of being a skeptic and an atheist and living a sinful life, which we all do? Otherwise, we wouldn't need God to begin with. What propelled you to say, I need to go and find out the truth here? What's going on? Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm right, but I need to find out. What was it that you said, boom, I got to do this?
I think the beginning of the story centers on my wife. I lived at school. I was, my goal was to help publish everybody on the planet. So I spent 7 days a week at school, and my wife, bless her heart, was home with 2 young children alone. We were poor as we used to joke that someday we could, if we really got successful, we could aspire to poverty level income. So my wife my wife wasn't a Christian, but she went back to the church of her youth and she got saved. She accepted Christ. And if you've never seen anybody transition from being a non-Christian to a Christian, an event to behold. So that got my attention, and I always supported my wife's Christianity. I went to church with her. I
Hmm.
went to potlucks. I liked her friends, and her friends started kind of pulling me into this whole thing. And I got involved in some Bible studies. I was going to church with my wife. I was with them in a men's group, but I was still an atheist. And in fact, I was probably doing more Christian things than most Christians were at the time.
Yeah.
And over time, and time I mean by months, I went from being pretty happy with my life to pretty miserable. And what was happening was I was caught in the middle of spiritual war. And once again, if you've never endured that, it's hard to explain. But it's sort of like being ripped in two pieces. The one part says, this Christianity actually looks pretty good. It sort of makes sense. And then the
Hmm.
other side was saying, this is stupid. You'll have to change who you are. This is not who you are. You can't be a scientist and be a Christian. And so the battle went back and forth and back and forth, and it was really a miserable time. And sort of a funny circumstance. I had been in a men's group at a restaurant, and a friend of mine and I were sitting in his pickup truck in the parking lot, and he said, "Hey, I'm in this evangelism class, and I'm supposed to share this thing called the Four Spiritual Laws. Could I practice on you?" And I said, "Sure." Well, if you're not familiar with it, the Four Spiritual Laws is a way of leading someone to Christ. So
Yeah.
he goes through the four laws, and he gets to the end, and he says, "Would you like to be a Christian?" And no one was more surprised about the answer than me when I said yes. It was like everything just came together. And I
Hmm.
want to make a point. It was important to me to be able to justify Christianity as something an intelligent scientist could believe. That was sort of the acid test. But
Hmm.
intellectual belief doesn't get you to Christ. That's always a decision of the heart. And what happened in that moment is, I guess God spoke to me. He took over whatever it was. Every argument, every concern, every fear I had simply dissolved, and I accepted Christ into my life. And I've been a Bible believing Christian ever since, which is now going on about 50 years. But
Well, that's
one
fantastic.
of the
Yeah,
things
that's
that
fantastic.
really turned things for me was
Hmm.
I was given a copy of Josh McDowell's book, Evidence That Demands a Verdict. And reading that book was like a wake up call. It was a tremendous slap in the face. Here I was, I prided myself as sort of being this fantastic uh, scientist. I lived it, I drank it, I ate it, I thought about it, I read about it. And all of a sudden, I find out that I've never even bothered to look at the evidence for Christianity, and almost everything I believed about Christianity was false. So that really convicted me about being a hypocrite. So,
Yeah.
one of the things that I did was I decided that if the Bible is false, I should be able to detect it. I'm a smart guy, I'm a scientist.
Hmm.
And the thing that really turned me there was once I began reading the Bible, it rang true.
Hmm.
It didn't read like something someone had made up. And in fact, just the opposite. So much of the Bible, you say, well, why would somebody who made this up uh, admit to denying Christ 3 times the night he was arrested.
Yeah.
Why did only one disciple show up for the crucifixion? Who would write that about themselves? And even worse, who would make up a story having a group of women discover the empty tomb?
Yeah.
In first century Rome, women couldn't even testify at a trial. Their testimony was deemed worthless. So
Yeah.
those are just a few examples, but I'm saying nobody, if you were making this up, you would never do that. You would make up a story that people would say, "That's nuts."
Yeah. Well, henceforth from your journey, we have this wonderful book, as I said in the introduction, Beyond Chance, from the Big Bang to the Empty Tomb. We're going to get into that part of it later, but I want to start with the Big Bang, if you don't mind. Um, what was the Big Bang? Because there is a lot of thought. I happen to be a big fan. We discussed this before, Steve, when you were on the show before. I'm a big fan of Nova. You know that. I love to watch Nova. I love the science. I love the stories about the planets and in the universe and everything else like that. What was the Big Bang for some people who are completely unaware of what it was? And then I have a
Okay,
follow up.
let me provide just a little bit of background. For centuries, scientists believed that the universe was eternal, that it had existed forever and was basically static. Um, and for Bible believers who believe that God created the heavens and the earth, in other words, the universe had a beginning. Um,
Right.
the scientists were sort of saying, hey, you folks are pretty scientifically naive. And in fact, what they were probably really saying behind closed doors is, those Christians sort of behave like people who put tinfoil on their head to keep aliens from reading their thoughts. Something interesting happened in the 1920s. We discovered that the universe wasn't static. In fact, it was expanding. And the further away the galaxies were, the faster they were moving. Well, logic says if something is expanding, that you should be able to trace back to the instant that it started expanding, right? I mean, it's just pure
Yeah.
logic. And of course,
Yes.
that's exactly what they did. And what they discovered is when they moved back 13.8 billion years, they did discover the beginning of the universe. And to make this simple, just imagine the universe was simply a teeny dot.
Hmm.
It wasn't really a dot, but for discussion purposes, think of it that way. If you can't imagine the dot, imagine a grain of sand. And we by the way, scientists call that the singularity. And
Excuse me.
at that moment, there was no time, there was no space, there was no energy, and there was no matter. And then that tiny, if you will, grain of sand began to expand. But expand is really the wrong word because in less than a trillionth of a second, it went from something the equivalent of a grain of sand to something the size of the galaxy. Bam! That's the Big Bang.
I want to go back to a question I'd asked you before. Was the Big Bang the originator of the universe, or was it a continuum? Did it add on to what the universe was already there? You discussed that briefly when you said just a few minutes ago that scientists believe that it was a continuum, that the universe is a continuum. But was the Big Bang the beginning of it all as we know today? And I will repeat this statistic because I just got it the other day and I find it unfathomable. There is over 2 trillion galaxies in the universe that we can see from telescopes, they say. This was on Nova, by the way. And how many planets are involved? So was some of the universe there and the Big Bang added to it, or the Big Bang started it all and that's where we take it from there?
The Big Bang was the beginning. Now, nobody knows what the singularity is. Nobody knows where it came from. And by the way, the singularity is almost more than a concept than it is
Hmm.
something physical. Okay. But once again, for practical purposes, let's think of this as a grain of sand. No, the singularity was the beginning. There was nothing, if you will, before that. It's hard to say before because time doesn't exist. But I would say the majority of scientists accept the universe had a beginning. Now, that's not true of everyone. Um, Naturalists who don't like the beginning of the universe because it's hard for them to explain have come up with alternate theories. One of those is that there are billions of multiverses, that is parallel universes, and it just so happened that in one of those we had all the things necessary to create the universe. I would just make this point: the multiverse is good science fiction. It's not science. There's not a
Hmm.
single shred of evidence to support it. And even if it were true, we'd still have to explain the original out of the billions of multiverses. There's another issue about quantum fluctuations, and I don't want to try to get into that. I will simply tell you that none of those explanations really pass muster. And once again, I believe the consensus is the universe had a beginning, and that beginning was 13.8 billion years ago. And by the way,
Yes, sir.
the fact that there are up to 2 trillion galaxies, and each galaxy has millions to billions of stars, it's pretty incredible. And in fact, as we speak, the visible universe is 93 billion light years across.
Yeah.
And if you wonder how big that really is, light travels nearly 6 trillion miles a year. So multiply 6 trillion times 93 billion, and you get the size of the universe. Now stop for a moment and imagine that all of that, stars, planets, dark holes, asteroids, comets, you name it, everything in the universe came from something smaller than a grain of sand.
Yeah. You just said that the universe is about 13, 14 billion years old, correct?
Yes.
Somewhere around there. Okay. How did they determine that? Now, I know one study that was done, a telescope. I think it was the latest one that went
Yeah.
up a few years ago. Went in there and they caught the color of one of the planets or something, and they go, well,
Yeah, it gets
maybe the
into a
Big
lot of
Bang was a
technical
lot
detail,
more.
and I'm not an expert on the
Yeah,
methodology that they use. I think they actually say it's 13.85 to be
yeah,
precise, and they have used, I think, 3 separate ways to estimate the origin of the universe, and I think they've found 3 ways that essentially agree.
yeah. When you talk to your Christian friends, and I bring this up because you would something in my brain went ding dong, ding dong. Many Christians that I talk to, and many that I see on programs when they're interviewed about, you know, how old is the Earth? How old is the universe? They all say the Earth is only 8,000 years old. Now, I have a feeling from what I've seen from scientists in Nova, and you can correct me if you're wrong, the Earth is like 4 billion years old itself, along with probably a lot of the planets that surround us here in the Milky Way galaxy. I always like that, the Milky Way galaxy. Um, but why do Christians literally hone in on that the earth was created and it's in 7 days? The Bible says, of course, in Genesis, and we're going to get to that a little bit later on too, at the beginning of life. Um, but do they hold to that to the point where they just don't want to believe the scientific evidence that no, the universe and everything around it is a lot older than 8,000 to 10,000 years old. As a matter of fact, man has been on Earth, for how many millions of years old?
Depends on what you call man. I believe that the first being that we could put in the human series was a creature called Homo erectus, and he
Yes.
showed up about 1.9 million years ago. If you're looking at modern man, Homo sapien, the first Homo sapien showed up about 300,000 years ago. But let me go back to the issue with Genesis and the age of the earth. For most of the time that people had been on this planet and read Genesis, they read that creation happened in 6 24-hour periods. And
Hmm.
everybody believed that. And frankly, there was no reason to think otherwise. Today, we know that the universe is a lot older than that. And by the way, they get
Yes.
to the 8 to 10,000 year period by looking at the genealogies in the Bible. But if we take a more serious, more modern look at Genesis, I think there are ways to read Genesis that match what we know. And let me do a quick aside and do a kind of a plug for part of my book. If you buy
Sure.
the
By the
book,
way, your book is called Beyond Chance: From the Big Bang to the Empty Tomb. And it's by
yes,
this gentleman right here, Mr.
and if
Stephen
you're and
Osborne.
if people watching this will read chapter 10, chapter
Yeah.
10 attempts to reconcile the creation of Adam and Eve with modern human evolution. But let me go
Hold
back.
off on that because I want to get to that later. I want to get to that later. There's a question.
Well, let me go
I
back
have
to
a
the
question
Talmud.
on that later. I have a question.
But let's look
Mm,
at the time. So if you
okay.
first of all, we need to recognize that Genesis was written in a very simple culture. It was a Near Eastern culture, very different from ours. Um,
Right.
at the time, Hebrew was a pretty primitive language. They didn't have a lot of terms, like scientific terms, etc. So I think we have
Hmm.
to appreciate the time in which it was written. But let's take a look when we talk about the term day in Genesis. The Hebrew word is yom, Y-O-M, and the traditional definition of yom is a 24-hour period. However, yom can have a different meaning. Yom can also refer to an indefinite period of time, like day of the Lord. The same word yom is used in either case. So, by the way, I make the case in chapter 10 of my book that in fact, we're not talking about 24-hour days. We're talking about periods of indefinite time. And by the way, that doesn't invalidate Genesis. It just means we're interpreting Genesis in a way that meets what we're pretty certain is true. It doesn't change anything in Genesis. Now,
Okay.
that will make some people unhappy, but once again, we're not perverting scripture. We're simply taking a look at an interpretation of some words that match what we know today to be pretty close to reality. So, by the way, I'm a firm believer that Genesis offers an accurate account of all creation. I know there's a lot of controversy there.
Hmm.
I said a few days ago on another interview, maybe if I live long enough, I'll write something that reconciles Genesis with what we know about modern science. I personally believe, as a Christian and as a science, that Genesis, as written, the message is accurate. Now,
Well, I hope you
if
get around to that
you
book because I want to get you on.
well, let's just pray that I live long enough to do it.
I have a feeling. I have a feeling, Steve, you're going to live a very long, happy, and lovely, wonderful life. I really do.
So,
Um.
any rate,
Yeah.
so um, I don't think I don't think people have to be afraid of Genesis. And there's a real concern, and part of the concern is what motivated me to write the book. There's a lot of disinformation in the world today. In
Yeah.
particular, there's a worldview called naturalism, and
Yeah.
naturalism says nature's all there is. Nature, the unguided laws of nature, can explain everything. So there are no miracles, there are no supernatural events, there's no need for God. And in fact, if we have nature, we don't need God to describe the universe. He's sort of redundant. Um,
Yeah.
and I think that's really acute among young adults, many of whom are really wrestling with an issue: can you trust science and still believe the Bible? Naturalists will tell you, no, you cannot. And naturalists, by the way, I think is deceiving a lot of people into believing that the choice is between faith and science. That's not the choice. Naturalism and not science. The choice is between naturalism and Christianity or some other worldview if that suits you. So
Hmm.
naturalism has done a really good job of disguising itself or masquerading as science when it
Yeah.
is not. So
Well,
a lot of the things I think that give people angst and people struggle over are simply a worldview, and in my opinion, a worldview that has been challenged. And in fact, one of the things that my book does is to challenge the whole issue of naturalism.
yes, and it's an excellent book, and I hope everybody runs out and gets it. Um, Dr. Stephen Osborne is my guest here on Main Street. Gary Allen with you. He is the author of this amazing book. Amazing book. It's called Beyond Chance: From the Big Bang to the Empty Tomb, and we are currently discussing right now Genesis. We will move on here in just a little bit. My thing is, I've known a lot of Christians in my life and everything. I even asked Dr. Stanley this once. I said, "Why do they believe that the earth is only like 10,000 years old?" He said, "Gary, it's just they like you said a few minutes ago. They literally look at the Bible and that's it. They don't want to know any more than that. They don't want to fill their brain with any more than they can deal with." And he said that's why they believe what they believe. He said, "It doesn't mean they're totally wrong. God's not going to punish them for it, but it is what they believe. He said, and you can't change them. So he said, I don't try. I just try to preach the Lord to them, and I kind of let it go at that. I want to kind of take a right turn here if I can. Um, what is dark matter, and is its purpose? Is it the glue that holds everything together? And explain what dark matter is, of course.
Okay. Let me talk about dark matter and dark energy because I think
Yes.
they're not related, but the story about them is sort of parallel. Um, Dark matter, first of all, cannot be seen. It cannot be measured directly, and it doesn't consist of normal matter like atoms, like regular matter. Uh, Dark matter makes up about 27% of the universe, and we only know it exists because of the effect that it has. Interestingly enough, and I don't remember the dates, but people were trying to go in and measure the mass of galaxies. And when they did that, they said, wait a minute, there's not enough mass here. And by the way, mass is important to a galaxy because it holds it together. Like you said, it's the glue that holds the stars and the planets and everything together within a galaxy. And when they looked at that, they said, well, wait a minute, there's not enough matter here. Well, that led people to start looking, and they discovered dark matter. But once again, you can only determine dark matter by the effect it has on the universe.
Hmm.
So, interestingly enough, when the universe actually began, there really wasn't enough matter from the singularity. So, it actually required dark matter to be added to regular matter so that we had enough for stars to form. Right? There's also a thing called dark energy. Like dark matter, you can't see it, you can't measure it, and it doesn't consist of normal atoms. And what dark energy does is, I think this is pretty interesting, is dark energy tends to push galaxies apart. So
Yes.
it's sort of anti-gravity. Gravity, pulls things together. Dark matter pushes them apart. And without dark matter, there would not have been enough energy. In other words, if without dark matter, the universe would have initially expanded and then collapsed onto itself. So one of the things that's happening is one of the reasons that the universes are expanding at the rate they are is dark energy. And here's something I find interesting. The
Hmm.
further things are apart, the stronger dark energy is. It's just
Really?
the opposite of gravity. In gravity, the closer things are, the stronger the gravitational pull, the further away, the less it is. Dark energy is just the opposite. Now, once again, neither of these can be seen or measured. They don't consist of normal matter. When you add the two together, they make up 95% of the universe. Now, think about this for a while. We have a universe that's 93 billion light years across, and only 5% of it is made up things that we can see or measure.
Hmm.
So I find that more than interesting, and I won't be able to quote it specifically, but there's basically a line in Hebrews that says, God created the earth, and he did it with things that are unseen.
Yes.
Okay. Now, well, was Hebrews talking about dark energy or dark matter? I have no clue. I just think it's a very interesting coincidence. And I
There's
think the
also
parallel,
there's also a thing in the Bible. Things that are seen never last. Things that are unseen will last forever.
yes, that's a good point.
I
Good
think I got.
point.
Did I get that right? Did I get that
I
right?
think
I
you
hope.
did. If you didn't,
Yeah.
you came close enough. So the
Yeah.
interesting point is here, we know dark energy and dark matter because of the effect they have on the universe. Uh, and I think there's an interesting parallel here because we know about God because of the effect he has on the universe.
Hmm.
Romans 1:20 says, since the beginning of creation, we've basically been able to see clearly the eternal power of God and his divine nature through what
Hmm.
he has made. In other words, if you want to see God, take a look at nature. because he's provided lots of evidence there for you to discover him.
Yep. What relationship, if any, does black holes, because they've only recently discovered, and I think they finally filmed one in our own galaxy, and it is enormous in size. I mean, it's thousands and thousands and thousands of, maybe a million, thousands of miles in length. But is there any relationship between dark energy, dark matter, and a black hole?
Not that I'm aware of, but once again, I'm not an astronomer, so I'm not the best person to ask. But based
Mm.
on my limited knowledge, I do not believe they are related.
But boy, I'll tell you, they say that if you get caught in one, goodbye. We ain't seeing Steve for a while, you know. But then again,
right.
yeah, but they don't know. It's like the narrator on Nova said, but we don't know where it goes into infinity, or does it go on the other side of the universe? Where
The
does the black
universe
holes go?
is full of mysteries. We've
Yeah,
only talked about some of them. Once again, I'm not an astronomer or an astrophysicist, but just almost as a lay position, there are so many mysteries in the universe, and I think there's a reason for that. Okay,
yeah,
I don't believe they're coincidence. I think the mysteries in the universe point directly to God. I made a point once again in an earlier interview.
hmm,
Oftentimes, we fail to be impressed by things because we take them for granted.
yes,
So when you take a look at the universe, it is huge and mysterious beyond anybody's ability to have a word to describe it. But when they wrote Genesis, nobody knew how big the universe was. You know, uh, the moon could have been a few hundred miles away. The sun could have been 1,000 miles away. You know, Uranus, the farthest planet in our solar system, could have been
hmm,
20 or 30,000 miles away. My point was, when they wrote Genesis and they wrote the Psalms, and they say the universe declares the handiwork of God, the majesty of God is seen in what He has created. My point is, if the universe were really tiny and unsophisticated, that would not honor what is declared in the Bible and declared in the Psalms, but just the opposite. When we look at the universe, we are just awestruck.
yeah.
There's just no word to describe the size and the majesty and the makeup of the universe. I've
Well,
said before, we sort of need the scientific equivalent of supercalifragilisticexpialidocious because
yeah.
it is really that big. In
Well,
fact,
yeah.
every time I start looking into the universe, it has a way of making me feel really small.
Yes. Yes. As my grandfather used to say, God do good work. You know,
Yes.
God do good work. Dark matter, is that good evidence of God's existence?
It is certainly evident for a force that is not easily explained under natural causes. And I think it is a pretty good um, signpost that points to God.
Do you think that, well, I thought I had a question there, but what I'm getting at is something that I was going to wait till the end, but now I think is a good time to bring it up. Do you think the reason people don't believe in God or Jesus or anything in faith is if you can't touch it, smell it, or see it, I don't believe in it?
I think that's part of the issue. Um, I think maybe a bigger issue is that we live in a culture that is super anti Christian and anti God. Um, it's everywhere. And I mentioned naturalism. Naturalism controls the narrative everywhere. People are taught it in grade school. If you go to college, it's reinforced. If you watch documentaries, it's there. It's in the media. It's in the social media. So I think part of it is this unending message from the naturalist that you don't need God, that
Yeah.
science has disproven the Bible and nature is all you need. So I think that's part of the problem. I think the other part of the problem is I don't believe as Christians that we have done a very good job of countering that claim.
Yeah.
There that by the way, that was part of the purpose of the reason I wrote Beyond Chance was to do
Hmm.
that. And by the way, and I don't mean to come on here and be a critic. I mean, I'm part of
No,
the
no,
Christian
please, please,
community.
please, please speak your piece.
I just, when I take a look at the statistics for young adults, it is truly heartbreaking and alarming. Uh, we are losing the battle for the hearts and minds of young adults. And once again, I know that will probably bother some people, but it's
Yeah.
true. Only about a third of I think it's Gen Z, uh,
Hmm.
affiliate with Christianity. Only 16% of that population attends services on a weekly basis.
Hmm.
And they are simply lost. It's going to be the lost generation for a lot of reasons. But I've heard it say that we're only one generation away of not having Christianity, and I believe that's true.
Yeah.
And when we look at, I believe it's Gen Z, that's that young generation of young adults. I think it's 16 to 25. I probably got those wrong, but it's generally in that age group. We are losing the battle for those souls. We just are.
Yeah.
And
I
once
mean,
again,
to me, it stems from like when I was growing up. My mom and dad didn't insist on it, but when I was living with my aunt and uncle in Pennsylvania, they insisted every Sunday I go to church. And it was a Baptist church, but I went to church. I got baptized, et cetera, et cetera. I've always believed in God, and I walked away from Jesus a little bit when I came back from a little thing that we were involved in Southeast Asia, and I'm sure you can understand why. That
yes,
kind of scrambles your brain a little bit for a while. But I eventually found my way back, thanks to Dr. Charles Stanley and my own brother, who is a Greek Orthodox priest who I love with all my heart and soul, Father Greg. And he's up there at St. Inagades in Marlborough, Massachusetts. A little plug for you, Greg. But, there's no one greater than Jesus Christ. He's my savior. He is the reason that I am where I am or where I'm not or what's going on. So yeah, Gen Z, but it comes from the mom and dad. If your mom and dad doesn't open the Bible or talk about God at the dinner table or Jesus, then then where are you going to get it? You're not going to get it in school, and you're not going to get it from your friends. They're not talking about it. So yeah, you're correct. 100%. They know of God, they know of Jesus, but do they believe what they hear? I want to kind of stay on course on chapter 2 of your book, which I found interesting. Talk about the majesty of God in nature.
that's a hard one. Well, first of all, I think we find his majesty in a lot of places. We find it in the beginning of the cosmos. We really find it in the beginning of life on Earth. The chapter you referred to talks about fine tuning, and this is interesting. So let's go back to the Big Bang when the singularity started to really explode.
Yeah.
But when we say explode, we might think of something like, somebody tossing a grenade. Well, it wasn't anything like that. And in fact, the expansion of the universe was remarkably precise. And in fact, it was governed and is still governed by a number of or equations, if you will.
Hmm.
And when we take a look at those, we find that these equations are incredibly fine tuned and they appear to be fine tuned with a purpose. And that purpose is to create a universe that will sustain life as we know it today. So when we take a look at some of these fine tuning consonants, it's incredible. And I don't have my notes in front of me, so may not get these exactly correct. But I believe if we look at the factor that governed the expansion of the universe, that it had to be within 1 in 10 to the 120th power for that to occur. In other words, if the universe expanded too quick, then it would have been too fast for stars and galaxies to form. And if it was too slow, it might have collapsed on itself. It had to be exactly right. Well, how right
Hmm.
did it have to be? Well, if you were relying on chance, that would only happen 1 in 10 to the 120th times. I said that a little bit better. So how big is 10 to the 120th? Well, it's number one with 120 zeros on it. To put things in comparison, there are only 10 to the 80th atoms in the entire universe. So 10 to the 120th is about 40 orders of magnitude bigger than all the atoms in the universe. And we're saying that if you really believe that that expansion was by chance, it's only going to happen about once in 10 to the 120th times. So that's fine tuning. Even scientists who are devoutly atheistic are sort of awestruck by what appears to be the fine tuning of the universe. And once again, not fine tuning for no reason, but fine tuning with the purpose of creating a universe that's suitable for life. So I think that's pretty majestic. Now, I don't remember, by the way, in the book, I identify some of the other constants, but it is insane. And if anybody believes that all that was just good luck, then I think I have a bridge in New York I'd like to sell you.
I want to do one more chapter from your book, and then we're going to take some questions that some friends of mine sent me to ask you. When did the earth awaken, and was the first living things on earth one-celled creatures? Even during the volcanic action that was going on when the earth was forming, they did say they found fossils of one-celled creatures. Was that the original life forms on earth back then?
The short answer is yes. We believe Earth originally formed about 4.5 billion years ago. And for about 500 years, it was sort of a hellacious place. It was, the land was molten lava. The seas were boiling hot. They call that the Hadrian era, Hadrian basically meaning hellish. So nothing would have survived until about 4 billion years ago. We have fossil evidence that began at about 3.5 billion years ago. But there's also some chemical evidence that pushes back the beginning to probably around 3.8 billion years ago. And the first living thing had to be a cell, otherwise it wouldn't be living. So the very first life on Earth was a cell. Now, I shouldn't say it was just a cell. A living cell is the most incredibly complex thing known to humans. A living cell has to have, at a minimum, have a membrane. It has to be able to reproduce. It has to have the ability to produce proteins, which do all the work in the cell. And it has to have a way of harnessing and using energy. So basically, the cell was this incredibly integrated molecular machine, the likes of which humans will never see, would never be able to replicate. So it is complex beyond words to describe, and more than just complex, all of the parts have to work together. So yes, the short answer is yes, the first living thing would be a complete cell. Otherwise, by definition, it wouldn't be living.
Okay, we're gonna go to at the beginning of the show, I ask all of you out there a question. Would you die for a lie? If Jesus Christ was who he says he was, and he rose, which the last couple of chapters of this wonderful book, Beyond Chance, from the Big Bang to the Empty Tomb, Dr. Osborne is going to talk about his last couple of chapters. He's only going to tease you now because I want people to buy this book. Where can they get the book, by the way, Dr. Osborne?
They can go to Amazon and get it there, or they can go to my website, steveosbornebooks.com. If they go to the website, they can also buy it there. If you go to the website, you can find out a little bit more about me and about the book. The other thing is download the first chapter and read it for free, so you can kind of get a sample to see if you want to spend $18 and get your own copy.
Okay, what I want to do is tackle this because this is the last question of the day. We're running. I didn't realize we were running out of time. It's been a quick hour. If if Jesus Christ was who he says he was crucified. He rose from the dead after 3 days. He eventually ascended into heaven after a couple of weeks because he walked around the earth according to the Bible. If all of that is true, then everything is great. But if it's false, what did the disciples, the apostles, what did they die for? If you knew for a fact that the person that you believed in was lying, would you die for him? Would you die for a lie? And Steve, I'll let you take it from here. And with the, what do we got left here? We got about 7 or 8 minutes left.
Okay. I'm never able to do anything quickly, but I'll give it a good shot. So, by the way, liars make really poor martyrs. So, if you look at the disciples of the 11 remaining, 10 died a martyr's death, at least to the extent that we know that. And you asked a good question. So, when we look at the Gospels, it was either made up, it was invented, or it's true. I mean, it's sort of a binary issue. And like you say, if it was made up, if these guys made this up, would they die for a lie? Now, you might be able to find one zealot, maybe one crazy person, but you normally don't find 10 out of 11. And as it turns out, by the way, nearly everyone involved of noteworthy name that was involved in the beginning of Christianity died a martyr's death. So let's go back, and my favorite piece of evidence is the disciples, what you just brought up. So I like to do the before and after. When you look at these big weight loss drugs, you see somebody that's big and fat and obese, and then you see this slender person. So you get the before and the after, and that's a testament to the fact that the drug that worked. So let's do a before and after of the disciples. So if you look at the disciples, first of all, the disciples never expected Jesus to rise from the dead. At the time, the Messiah within Judaism was expected to come back and be a king, that they were going to reestablish Israel's kingdom as it had been before. So nobody at that time, including the Jews, believed the Messiah was going to be a dying savior. So first of all, the disciples were never looking for Jesus to resurrect. And in fact, when he died, it was like the world's biggest bummer. But let's take a look at these guys. I mean, we mentioned this before. Peter denied knowing Christ 3 times the night he was arrested. And he just didn't deny, he was vehement. Only one disciple attended the crucifixion. If you take a look at these guys, even when the women on Sunday morning, the women went to the empty tomb and they came back and they said, hey, we just saw an angel and Jesus is written, and I'll paraphrase, they basically said, you're nuts, right? I mean, they said, no, let's go see for ourselves. And in fact, Peter and John run to the tomb, and we kind of know that story. So if you take a look at who, and then if we continue the story into the evening of that day, 10 of the 11 are kind of huddled together in the upper room, scared to death that the Jewish authorities are going to come and arrest them. All right. So, and then of course, that's when Jesus appeared to them. But my point is, if you wanted to describe the disciples before the resurrection, bravery is not one of the words you would use, nor would courageous. I mean, these guys, quite frankly, were cowering, timid folks. Then all of a sudden, they witnessed the resurrection of Christ. In fact, there are eight cases in the New Gospels that they identify where that was. And actually, Christ was with them for 40 days. He walked with them, he ate with them, he talked with them. So what happened? So this group of people that were not courageous, that were not brave, turned around and endured persecution and torture and hell on earth to proclaim the gospel. They were burned, they were skinned, they were crucified, you name it, it was done to them. And to a person, to their dying breath, they confessed the gospel. So
the only one that didn't die to martyr was James, his brother, and he died of old age. Was it John? John. I thought it was James. John. No. He died of old age. He was in, I think, a prison or something like that. But Thomas had his eyes gouged out. Peter was crucified upside down. Paul had his head cut off, and Paul, of course, was blinded, then not. So, yeah, would you die for a lie? That's my question.
Well, the answer to that is no. People don't die for a lie, and it's more than that. Not only did these men suffer persecution and die, but they told their friends, they told their families. So not only did they die for a lie, they took friends and family with them. And I'll go back to what you said before. Nobody dies for a lie. So one of the pieces of evidence that has to be
Yeah.
explained in the resurrection, if you want to believe there's a natural explanation, then you
Yeah.
have to explain the reason that the disciples truly believed that they had seen a resurrected Christ. And I will tell you, I have a pretty hard time doing that. I want to say as an aside, however, that is not the only evidence that supports the resurrection.
We've got we actually have a little bit more time than I thought. Where are we? I'm trying to look at my watch here. I got about quarter to the hour. Um, in your book, you have a conclusion. Can you tease us with some of the conclusions you kind of have come to? Just tease now, because again, I want people to go out, go on Steve's website, go to Amazon, get this book. It's a wonderful book. It's called Beyond Chance. Excuse me, I keep saying choice. Beyond Chance, from the Big Bang to the Empty Tomb. And by the way, if all of that is false, if they keep trying to say, oh well, they took his body here, they took his body there. No, I believe he ascended to heaven. He's sitting at the right hand of the Lord, and I believe he intervenes on our behalf. Steve, I do believe in that an awful lot. And if it's wrong, well, then a lot of us are going to be terribly disappointed. But I don't think any of us are wrong who really believe in the Lord and our Savior Jesus Christ. He is the way. I have a famous saying. I don't know if you'll agree with this. There are many roads to Jesus, but there's only one to salvation.
Agree with that. I'm the way, the truth, and the life. Nobody comes to the Father except through me.
What are some of your conclusions? I mean, without giving them all away, because I know there's probably more than one or two in the end.
Well, let me go back and say Christ either rose from the dead or he did not. There's no in between. He either did or he didn't. And the
Yeah.
consequences are the most important thing that's ever happened in human history. If he
Right.
didn't raise from the dead, then Christ is a liar. People like to say, well, he was a philosopher and he was a nice guy. No, if he wasn't God, he was a liar. He should be despised, not honored. And I don't buy this. He was a great prophet. Great prophets don't come and lie to the people and tell them they're going to have eternal life when they aren't. So Christ either rose or he didn't. So let's take a look at some of
Yeah.
the things that we have
We've
to address.
got 2 minutes to go.
Okay. So you have to explain the changed behavior of the disciples. You have to change the conversion of Paul, whose life's goal was to destroy Christianity, and how he turned around and became its greatest promoter and wrote about half of the New Testament. And you have to explain the conversion and ministry of James, Jesus' half brother, who ended up writing the book of James and was a key figure in the Jerusalem church and one of the first Christian martyrs. So if you work your way all through that, I will give you the bottom line, and you can go and hopefully read my book and fill in the data.
All right.
It's
I want to thank you.
it's impossible to take a historical event and say it's proved. By the way,
Yeah.
it really is impossible. But let me tell you this: if proof is 100 points, then the resurrection is about 97. The
Yeah.
resurrection comes as close to becoming historical fact as you can come without being a fact. So it's right up there. So, by the way, I want to give your viewers a phrase that I hope they will remember, and it's Latin. It's called nullius in verba, and it was the the motto of the very first scientific organization in London in 1660. And what does that mean? It means don't take anybody's word for it. So my point is, don't take anybody's word for it. Go look at the evidence. Let the evidence convince you, and follow the evidence wherever it leads. And I promise you, if you follow the evidence, it will lead you right to Christ.
Well, Dr. Osborne, I want to thank you so much for joining us here on Main Street. You and I are going to talk because I got to have you back. I'm going to talk to Gina, your agent. I got to have you
You're a
back. I
glutton for
hope you
punishment.
enjoyed the show. But most of all, I want to thank all of you out there for taking the time to join us today. I hope everybody's happy and safe. Please stay out of the heat. It is hot out there. Stay cool, stay happy. God bless you. And until next time, God bless you and take care.